Welcome to my channel. At the beginning of this episode, I would like to thank you very much for all the subscriptions, likes, and comments. I appreciate it very much. Today I will tell you about the events of 2018, which took place in the United States, in Austin, Texas, where Ted and Corey Shaughnessy lived. They met in the 1980s and immediately noticed how much they had in common. One of those things was a love for jewelry, and it wasn't just that they loved owning something pretty. Ted was already working in a jewelry store, but dreamed of owning his own. And after they married, the couple opened such a store in 1999. The work gave them a lot of satisfaction. They loved to see people trying to pick out a gift for someone close to them, to make them happy. Their store prospered better and better. They were financially stable, and the young couple then began to think about expanding their family. Corey became pregnant several times, but failed to carry any of them to term. With each miscarriage, she took it worse and worse, so she came to the conclusion that she would not try for a child again. But because she really wanted to be a mom, the couple eventually decided to adopt. To speed up the process, Ted and Corey decided to adopt a child from outside the United States, specifically from Ukraine. And in 2000, a 16-month-old boy came into their family. The couple immediately loved him, and from the very beginning they devoted as much time to him as they could. They were always inseparable to the point that their friends referred to them as the Three Musketeers. The boy was the apple of their eye, and since Ted and Corey had no shortage of money, Nicholas was pampered from an early age. He was given everything he could think of. When he was a little bigger, the boy spent a lot of time with his dad, who was fascinated by fast cars and sometimes participated in their races. The boy always accompanied him. When Nicholas was in high school, he met a girl with whom he immediately fell in love, and since then, he and Jacqueline Edison were inseparable. They spent a great deal of time together, mostly hanging out at the boy's house. She was there so often that despite the fact that Nicholas was only 17 years old, his parents allowed her to live in their house. The couple didn't settle there for long, however, as just a year later in August 2017, they moved out of Nicholas's family home and settled in College Station, a city about a 2-hour drive from Austin. Jackie intended to study there, while her boyfriend was busy investing the money he received from his parents. After they moved away from their home, Ted and Corey stayed there alone and had time just for themselves. It was not given to them to enjoy themselves too much, because already in March 2018, something happened that no one would have expected. The 1st of March 2018 was exactly like any other day. It was a Thursday, and Ted was in the store that day. When he got home, the couple had dinner, after which they went out for a walk with their dogs, 2 Rottweilers that had been in their family for some time. After walk, they spent the rest of the evening in front of the TV. When they went to bed, they didn't assume that this one would completely change their lives. The two had already been asleep for quite some time when they heard one of their dogs start barking. They looked at the alarm clock. It was after 4:30. They were a little concerned that the dog started barking at such an hour, so Ted grabbed a gun, of which they had about 20 in the house, and went to check what had happened. He thought that perhaps the dog had spotted some wild animal. It wasn't uncommon for a deer or opossum to appear near their house. Corey stayed in the bedroom, expecting that in a moment Ted would return there as well. But shortly after her husband left the room, she heard the first gunshot, followed immediately by another. She guessed that they were coming from the kitchen, which was not far from the room she was in at the time, and immediately grabbed the gun lying, as always, on the shelf above the bed. She saw the flashlight lights approaching the bedroom and could only guess that she would be next. She completely failed to see who the person was who had invaded their home. The flashlight light was extremely intense and shone right into her eyes. When she heard the first shot aimed at her, she didn't think any longer. She started pulling the trigger. She heard the man in front of her continue to shoot, but despite the fact that she was convinced she was about to die, none of the bullets hit her. When she ran out of ammunition after a while, Corey grabbed her phone and headed toward the closet with all her might. The only thing on her mind at the time was to hide and call for help. She expected that in a moment Someone would open the closet door, and she could be killed at any moment. But if she had time to dial the emergency number, maybe the operator would hear that there had been a shooting in their house. Since no one had looked in the closet, she started talking to the operator and told her what had happened in their house. She didn't know if the man was still there, so she tried to speak as quietly as she could. All the time, she could hear someone hurting in the kitchen. She guessed that it was Ted, and she really wanted to get out of the closet at that moment and go to him. Maybe he could still be helped, but the woman she spoke to prevented her from leaving that place. She was to stay where she was until the police showed up in front of her house. Roughly 15 minutes had passed when Corey heard on the phone that she could now go open the door for the police officers. To do so, she had to walk past the kitchen, and that's when the woman noticed her 55-year-old husband, Ted. He was lying on the floor and showed absolutely no signs of life. Near her husband lay one of the dogs. He certainly had not survived the break-in. Corey, with all her might, opened the front door, but despite the fact that the emergency number operator assured her that the police were already there, there was no one in front of her house. It turned out that they had mixed up the addresses and went to her neighbor's house. However, when the police officers appeared outside the door of Corey's house after a while, the woman could breathe a sigh of relief. She already felt safe, but after a while she heard what she had suspected from the moment she saw her husband lying in the kitchen. Ted had unfortunately not survived. It was terrible news for her. Her whole world collapsed in an instant, and she still had to inform their son about everything. She knew very well that it would not be easy for him to come to terms with what had happened. When she called Nicholas, he decided that he and his girlfriend, Jackie, would come to Austin, which should take them roughly 2 hours. And in the meantime, the police officers were doing their job. They all suspected that someone had broken into the house in order to rob them. It was quickly determined that all the windows and doors were locked, except for one window located on the first floor. Normally, there was a mosquito net in it, but the burglar had removed it and placed it next to the window. Most likely, this is how the man got inside. This window led to a bedroom, which was empty at the time, no one living in it. But police officers noticed that one of the drawers in the dresser was open, and a gun had disappeared from the box that was there. After checking the shell casings found in the kitchen, it could be suspected that it was the one used to kill Ted. But in addition to these shell casings, other shell casings were found that came from another gun. Could this have meant that two people had broken into Shaughnessy's house? Initially, police officers, as well as Corey herself, thought it was a robbery. People knew that they were the owners of a luxury jewelry store and probably expected that maybe they kept some of it in the house. But soon after police officers arrived at the scene, it was determined that absolutely nothing had disappeared from the couple's home. If it wasn't money or any valuables, why did someone break into their home and kill Ted? When Nicholas and Jackie showed up in Austin around 8 a.m. and, along with Corey, spoke with police officers, all three declared they were willing to help with the investigation. Nicholas and Jackie couldn't say too much because they were in a completely different city when the murder occurred. From what Ted's son told police officers, the last time he was in Austin was to see his parents a month earlier. As for Corey, during her interview with the officers, she recounted exactly what happened that night and without hesitation gave the investigators her phone so that it could be checked. After they interviewed her, she started to realize that she was being treated as a prime suspect, because indeed the whole story was a bit strange. Someone breaks into their house, takes a gun from a drawer, which he later uses to kill just one of the people present in the house. Why did he let her get out of the situation unscathed? Was Ted the only target? If so, then maybe Corey was the one who killed her husband, especially since after his death, she would be the one to receive all the money from the insurance policy, which was $1 million. Also, why was nothing taken from the house? Nothing was taken from the safes that contained the money, but nothing was taken from the house either. Corey had her jewelry, Ted had his watches. None of these things interested the burglars. Also, how did they know where they could find weapons? The house was quite large, and for someone who didn't know it, it wouldn't have been so easy to navigate. They also didn't have that much time to be able to quietly find the weapons. There were many questions, but from the very beginning, everything pointed to the fact that the person responsible for the break-in and Ted's death was someone from the family or friends. Of course, his wife was the most suspected. She would not be the first woman who wanted to get rid of her husband in order to get her hands on the money from his policy. After his death, she would not only receive $1 million from the policy, but would also become the owner of a stately home and a store. Investigators were even more inclined to believe this version of events after they checked the house and found no fingerprints there that did not belong to the family. But when a few weeks after Ted was killed, Corey tried to withdraw money from her insurance policy, investigators were convinced that she was responsible for his death. She wasn't poor, and she didn't need the money so suddenly. But she could explain it. She must have used it to buy jewelry for her store. Corey, of course, admitted nothing, and was even outraged that she was the one suspected, instead of being involved in the search for the real perpetrator at the time. But investigators did not rule out the possibility that someone else might have wanted Ted dead, and they continued to try to determine who killed him, all the while looking for clues in Mr. and Mrs. Shaughnessy's house. An alarm was installed there, but according to Corey, they were not in the habit of turning it on every day. Rather, they only did it when they went out and the house was empty. But even so, thanks to the app operating this alarm, the police officers obtained some information. It was already known that the bedroom window was opened at 4:27 a.m. After that, the burglars stayed in the house for several minutes, until the first shots were fired 17 minutes after they entered, one of which hit the glass in the window. And as far as these time frames were concerned, everything agreed with what Corey testified. However, what were the burglars doing in their house for several minutes, if they didn't steal anything? Everything that happened that night did not add up to a logical whole. Once the police had completed their work at the Shaughnessy home, Corey was finally able to return there. At first, it was not easy for her to live alone in such a big house, so Nicholas and Jackie decided to move in with her for a while. They went to their house, from where they took all the things they needed and returned to Austin. The three of them would find it easier to get through their grief. But shortly after they moved in, Nicholas and Jackie gave Corey information she didn't expect. In fact, they must have done so, because in order to rule out Nicholas's involvement in the murder, the cops also searched the house where he lived in College Station, and then they found a marriage certificate, which showed that more than 6 months earlier, in the summer of 2017, he and Jackie had married. They didn't tell anyone about it, neither their relatives nor the police at the time they were interviewed. When it came to light, the couple had no choice but to tell Corey everything. She was very surprised by the news. She believed that both of them were still too young for marriage. They were only 19 years old. And since their wedding was a very modest ceremony, Corey decided that they should have a decent wedding. They started planning an engagement party, which allowed them to forget about the ongoing investigation, at least for a while. Sometimes they felt that the investigators would not be able to figure out who killed Ted. Everything had been going on for so long, and still nothing was known. Nicholas and Jackie had been living in Austin for some time, and Corey then got the idea that it would be much easier for her if they could both help her in the store. She knew she wouldn't be able to take care of it herself. If her son and daughter-in-law refused to help her, she would have to start thinking about closing the store. But to Corey's surprise, Jackie decided to take a dean's break, and her son, who was in charge of selling and buying auctions, decided to suspend his business for a while. And then all three of them concentrated on their work at the jewelry store, and investigators continued to work to determine who might have killed Ted. And just as at first they were convinced that his wife was responsible, over time they began to suspect someone else. They suspected his adopted son, Nicholas. Admittedly, at the time of the murder, he was at his home 170 kilometers away, which was confirmed by the location of his phone. But it also made it possible to establish that he was not telling the police officers the whole truth. At the outset, He told them that he had not been in his hometown for a month, but it was established that he had been there just 2 days before Ted's murder, on February 28th. The strange thing was that since he had traveled so many miles, he had not visited his parents. Could it be that he was putting the final touches on everything at the time? The text messages that Nicholas and Jackie sent to each other were also suspicious. First of all, their phones had their factory settings overturned, which meant that any messages sent before Ted's death could not be found there. But police officers managed to recover them. They were very vague, but they implied that Nicholas would try to arrange something and therefore had to pay someone $50,000 in cash, $25,000 before, and the rest after. Investigators guessed that it could have been about payment from the order to kill Ted. Another thing that wasn't immediately pointed out but could indicate that Nicholas knew more than he was telling them was how, immediately after arriving at his parents' house and talking to the police officers for a while, went to see the location of the window through which the burglars had entered. Only that it was only after some time that the policeman realized that no one at the time had told him how it happened. Nicholas had not been told by them about the mosquito net being removed and entering through the window, so how did he know exactly where to go? That window was not visible from the front of the house. He could not see it while standing in front of it. But that wasn't the only thing that pointed to Nicholas as being responsible for killing Ted. He had an app on his phone that allowed him to access the alarm system in his parents' house. With it, he could turn the alarm on and off, but he could also see exactly which window had been opened. And Nicholas logged into this app on the morning of March 2nd at 5:39 a.m. It was only a few minutes later that Corey called him to tell him about his father's death. This behavior by Nicholas was very suspicious, as if he was checking to see if the plan had been carried out. But investigators found something else. When they checked the house where he and Jackie lived together, they found a safe that contained a lot of jewelry and watches, but also guns and ammunition. What was surprising? The ammunition was exactly the same company and caliber as the shell casings found in Shaughnessy's house. There was a fair amount in the safe, but 6 pieces were missing. There were increasing indications that he may have wanted Ted dead, but a conversation with his friend, who was the man giving them the wedding, only confirmed that investigators were getting closer to solving the case. Spencer Patterson knew Nicholas back in high school. They had been friends for many years. They had no secrets from each other and knew they could always rely on each other. But sometime before Ted's death, Nicholas came to him with a request that he could not fulfill. He told him about the fact that in the event of the death of his parents, he would become the sole heir, and everything he inherited would be worth $8 million. However, he had no intention of waiting for their deaths. There was no telling when this would happen, and he might have to wait many more years for the estate. Therefore, he came up with the idea that both of them must die. He knew that he could not do it himself, because as a family he would be immediately in the circle of suspects. But after all, no one would suspect his best friend. To confirm that he was telling the truth, Spencer showed the investigators the messages he had received from Nicholas. In them, he wrote that he only needed to enter their house and kill them, and then steal a few items. He also wouldn't have to put on any mask, since they would both be dead afterwards anyway. Spencer, of course, did not agree to his proposals. In fact, he did not think Nicholas was serious about it. But sometime later, it turned out that he wasn't joking after all. Someone had killed Ted. Spencer's testimony led to the fact that on May 29, 2018, Nicholas and his wife were arrested, which came as a shock to everyone, especially Corey. She did not believe that her son could have had anything to do with his father's death. Maybe the investigators were wrong about him, just as they were wrong at first, suspecting her. But when she saw the message her son sent to his friend, she realized that everything that happened in March was planned by him. For her and Ted, he was the whole world. They did everything they could for him. All the time he lived with them, bought him everything he wanted. When he decided to move and start working in the stock market, Ted and Corey lent him $30,000 at the time so he would have something to invest. He had already taken an interest in the stock market in high school, and knew that he didn't want to waste his time studying further, but was going to start working right after school. His parents weren't too happy with his choice, but they hoped that maybe the job would quickly bore him, and he would eventually decide to continue his studies. But in addition to the fact that he could always count on his parents to lend him money, even though he was already living separately, they still covered most of his expenses. They were the ones who paid his bills, paid for his insurance, or even paid for his petrol. Admittedly, Nicholas was supposed to return some of that money to them, but he was in no hurry to do so. For their part, Ted and Corey noticed that Nicholas and Jackie had to spend a lot of money on new clothes or furnishings for their apartment. They were more focused on fulfilling their whims than on settling their obligations. And at some point, Corey decided that it couldn't go on like this. She and Ted work hard morning to night, while their son spends money with a light hand on something he can't afford. Therefore, shortly before Ted's death, they stopped funding their son's expenses. He was not very happy with this decision, but sometime later, he returned part of the loan to Corey. She thought that he had finally begun to take life seriously, that maybe he finally understood what life as an adult was like. First of all, you have to pay all your obligations. Only later can you afford to spend money on pleasures. What she didn't realize at the time, however, was that her son was already planning her and her husband's deaths. But investigators continued to wonder who really killed Ted. They already knew that it certainly wasn't Nicholas or Jackie. The CCTV footage they had installed in their home confirmed that they were 170 kilometers from Austin at the time. So who were the people who were supposed to receive $50,000 from them in exchange for killing the Shaughnessy couple? Neither Nicholas nor Jackie, who were in custody, had any intention of making the investigators' task easier and giving them the names of these people. Therefore, they began reviewing the footage from the cameras installed in Nicholas's home. Maybe he had met with these people at his home, and they then noticed that 2 days before the murder, on February 28th, 2 men came to his house. One of them wore a company t-shirt, which led police officers to a window installation company. The cameras installed in Nicholas's home were of fairly good quality, and the man's face was clearly visible. Therefore, the investigators went to this company's network to ask about him there. They immediately recognized him, despite the fact that he had only worked there for a few days, and on top of that 4 years earlier. Police officers got his name and address and immediately went to his home. Unfortunately, Cameron Vosbeck was not at home at the time. But before the investigators had time to say anything to his wife, they heard something that surprised them incredibly. The woman was supposed to know why they showed up at her house. Most likely, the policeman wanted to talk to her husband in connection with this boy who wanted to kill his parents and was looking for someone who could do it. That was probably the last thing the investigators expected to hear that day. Cameron's wife then explained that her husband didn't know the boy personally, but one day his friend Johnny Leon told him he had an extra job for them. They were to help someone move. It was then that they went to Nicholas's house, but when they got there, the conversation began to take a completely different turn. Nicholas then talked about the people living in Austin to whom he has to pay $10,000 a month, so they should be taken care of. Cameron didn't immediately understand what he meant, but when he heard that the less he knew the better for him, it occurred to him that it wasn't about any small favor, but about depriving someone of their life. Since he was not a man who could agree to this, he immediately left his house. And indeed, on the CCTV footage, he can be seen leaving earlier than Johnny. Further investigation was able to confirm that he was telling the truth. He was not one of the people who were in Shaughnessy's house that night. The cops decided to talk to Johnny, especially since he was the other man who came to Nicholas's house on February 28th. At first, he denied everything. Only when he saw himself entering Nicholas's house on a surveillance camera photo, then he started talking. He admitted that he had received such an offer from him. He was supposed to kill his parents, for which he was to receive $100,000, but he did not agree to it. For this, on February 28th, he went with him to Austin. Nicholas was then to kill his parents himself. They stopped the car near their house, and he was about to go inside and do what no one wanted to do for him. But after a while he returned to the car. He lacked the courage to go in there and take their lives. According to Johnny, that was the last time he had to deal with Nicholas and anything related to him. But it turned out he wasn't telling the whole truth, because just 2 days later, on March 2nd, his phone was logging near Shaughnessy's house. Investigators already knew that he was one of the people who killed Ted that night. Unfortunately, he did not want to admit who the other person was, but again, his phone proved helpful. Because before Ted's murder, Johnny had often been in contact with one of his friends, Ariane Smith. Like Johnny, he was also well known to the police. When he was taken in for questioning, Ariane insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder of the jeweler. He had spent that night with his girlfriend, and she could confirm everything. But when the police officers talked to her, the girlfriend admitted that she was alone that night. Ariane had gone somewhere by car and was gone for most of the night. She tried repeatedly to call him, but he wouldn't answer the phone. Eventually, Ariane confessed. He told in detail what happened that night, and he pointed out the place where he hid the gun taken from Shaughnessy's house and which he used to kill Ted. Investigators also learned why Corey managed to survive. In fact, she was also supposed to die that night. But when Ted was already lying on the floor and Johnny was walking toward the couple's bedroom, Ariane realized that he didn't want to kill the woman, especially since he had heard the sound of gunshots coming from that room, which meant that they might not make it out alive either. He asked Johnny to spare her life, and after a while they were both already running out of Shaughnessy's house. Thanks to the fact that Corey had learned how to handle a gun and did not hesitate to use it when threatened, she managed to survive. Investigators have already arrested all 4 people linked to the murder: Nicholas and Jackie, who planned everything, and Johnny and Ariane, who agreed to kill the 19-year-old's parents. During further questioning, Jackie cooperated willingly with the police, all the while blaming everything on her husband. It was his debts that led to his decision to kill his parents. In fact, his private account, as well as the account from which he used the money to invest, were empty. Not even $2 were there. He urgently needed the money his parents had, and was not only owed money to them, but had previously borrowed money from his neighbor as well. He borrowed $2,600 from her, and as the deadline for when he should pay it back had passed, and Nicholas did not have the means to repay the debt, the woman threatened to contact his parents and tell them all about it. He had to get the money quickly. However, Nicholas initially tried to convince Jackie that he had a completely different reason for killing his parents. Apparently, his father had been battling depression for a long time. Jackie didn't see it in his behavior, but it's clear that not everyone shows their emotions. Nicholas believed that his father no longer felt like he wanted to live, and he would only try to make it easier for him. He also knew that his mother was very attached to her husband. They spent many years together, celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in January 2018, and she certainly won't be able to imagine life without him. Therefore, the best solution would be for them both to die. Jackie didn't really believe his words. She thought he was just saying that and really had no intention of harming his parents. Before the trial took place in April 2021, Nicholas, with Johnny and Ariane, agreed to a plea bargain, according to which they would plead guilty, and in return, the death penalty would no longer be considered. All 3 received the same sentence, 35 years in prison with the possibility of early parole. But what about Jackie's case? She was not charged with Ted's murder, but with planning to commit the murder. She herself believed that there was little involvement in all the planning. It was her husband who cared about the death of her parents. She had all the time hoped that this would not happen. And finally, in July 2023, she was offered a plea bargain that was surprising compared to the sentences of the other 3. She was given a 120-day prison sentence, and in addition, for the next 10 years, she would have to return to prison for 2 days on each anniversary of Ted's death. If she broke the law during those 10 years, then she would be jailed for 20 years. Such a sentence was surprising to everyone. It was believed that the girl had actually escaped responsibility, having spent 4 months in prison, while the others involved in planning this murder must spend a minimum of 17 years there. No one could explain why there was such a difference in these sentences. Thank you for listening to the end. Goodbye.